Most shipwrecks disappear. They sink beneath the water and vanish into the dark. But some never fully went away. These are 5 massive World War II era ships sitting on the ocean floor. Some still seep oil drop by drop. Some leak only after storms or heavy winter seas. Others have already been partly drained, but still show why sunken fuel can be almost impossible to erase completely. One sits beneath a famous memorial. One is protected as a war grave with ammunition still inside the hull. And one is a ghost ship whose oil returns when winter currents shake the wreck. With modern underwater engineering, the obvious question is why no one can simply pump all the oil out and stop the leaking permanently. People assume that modern salvage teams can drain any sunken hull. The reality is that the physical consequences of the war have reached the extreme limits of modern salvage. The United States Navy pumped 1.8 million gallons out of a single wreck, yet even that did not make the site perfectly clean. The catastrophic threat was reduced, but residues and unreachable pockets remained inside a hull the war had turned upside down. These are 5 wrecks that still exist in a condition the war left behind. Black droplets bubble up to the surface of Pearl Harbor every day. They spread across the shallow water to create a visible, iridescent slick that visitors call black tears. The heavy bunker fuel has a distinct smell that drifts across the modern memorial. Beneath the water lies the USS Arizona, a United States Navy Pennsylvania class battleship. It is the most famous sunken warship in American history and an active military cemetery. On December 7, 1941, an armor-piercing bomb detonated the forward magazines of the great ship. The catastrophic explosion severed the ship and dropped the heavily fueled hull to the harbor floor in a matter of minutes. The resulting fire burned for over 2 days, warping the steel decks and compromising the internal bulkheads. Because the vessel had just taken on fuel the day before the attack, an immense volume of heavy fuel oil went down with the wreckage. Today, the ship remains exactly where it sank. It holds the remains of over 900 crewmen and an estimated 500,000 gallons of bunker C fuel oil. The ship is actively leaking between 2 and 9 quarts of oil every single day. Environmental scientists and the National Park Service monitor the wreck constantly to measure the environmental impact on the surrounding harbor. The obvious solution would be to bring in salvage equipment, drill into the lower hull, and pump the remaining fuel out to preserve the pristine waters. But the United States Navy and the National Park Service explicitly refuse to drill into the tanks. The primary barrier is moral and legal. The ship is an untouched war grave and a highly protected national memorial. For decades, Navy divers were sometimes called to the wreck for one of the most solemn duties in American naval memory, placing the ashes of eligible Arizona survivors back inside the hull with their shipmates. That practice was never routine, and the final survivor interment took place in 2019. Disturbing the structure with heavy drilling equipment still means disturbing the entombed crew, an act the military and the National Park Service treat with extreme caution. The secondary barrier is structural. The Arizona rests in shallow harbor water, not at crushing ocean depth, but the hull is still a burned, corroding maze of steel. The fuel is divided through more than 200 compartments, and the bulkheads that contain it grow more fragile with every year underwater. Drilling into that metal could disturb weakened compartments, open new paths for oil, or force crews to cut into sections that also hold human remains. In the worst case, a badly managed intervention could release far more oil than the slow drop-by-drop leak seen today. That is why the feared disaster is not just the oil itself, but the act of trying to remove it from a sacred and unstable wreck. The problem is actively getting worse as time passes. Scientists have studied marine microbes around the leaking oil, and the biology of the wreck is part of the larger corrosion problem. But the process is not simple. Microbial life, concretion, salt water, oxygen levels, and time all interact on the steel, making the Arizona a living laboratory for how oil and metal decay together. The uncomfortable trade-off is severe. Preserving the sanctity of the memorial means accepting a perpetual daily leak. It means accepting that the structure will eventually fail on its own when the ocean finally consumes the steel. The pristine white memorial remains suspended over the rusted hull, watching the black oil rise. The Arizona is protected by its sacred status, But the next wreck remains untouched because getting the oil out could trigger a massive explosion. A massive inverted steel hull rests in the dark waters of Scapa Flow. Commercial divers periodically descend into the pitch-black water to gently tap into its freezing skin. This is HMS Royal Oak, a British Revenge-class battleship lying upside down off the coast of Scotland. It is one of the most significant protected Royal Navy war graves and one of the defining military wrecks in the history of underwater oil removal. Scapa Flow was considered a fortress for the British fleet. But in October 1939, a German submarine penetrated the secure naval base and torpedoed the enormous ship while it was resting at anchor. The massive warship capsized and sank in just 13 minutes. The rapid disaster trapped the crew and the immense volume of fuel inside the hull. Because the ship capsized, the heavy armor belt is buried in the mud while the thinner bottom hull faces the surface. Today, the ship remains an upside-down labyrinth of jagged steel. The Ministry of Defense runs slow, decades-long phased extractions using delicate hot tap technology. Hot tapping is an engineering process that allows divers to drill through the hull and attach valves without letting surrounding water in or trapped oil out. Since 2006, salvage teams have successfully removed over 1,600 tons of oil from the wreck, but they cannot resolve the problem completely. The deepest, crushed inner wing tanks are incredibly difficult to reach because the ship was originally built as a coal burner and later converted to oil. The real danger around the remaining difficult sections is not just oil. Royal Oak also went down with significant unexploded ordnance, and the ship is legally protected as a war grave. That means every intervention has to be limited, surveyed, and justified. Heavy work near damaged structure and wartime ammunition could destabilize the site or create risks that no environmental gain would justify. Because of this risk, the government has managed the wreck slowly, with the hull left in place and the most sensitive areas treated with restraint. More than 1,600 tons of heavy fuel oil have been removed, and installed hot tap valves allow remaining pockets to be monitored or pumped off when necessary. This is not a wreck that can simply be emptied and forgotten. It is a protected grave, an ammunition hazard, and a long-term engineering obligation. The Royal Oak sits in a remote Scottish anchorage, but the next wreck was leaking directly beneath one of the busiest shipping lanes in America. A massive salvage barge anchored off the coast of New York, pulling thick fluid from a mound of jagged, muddy metal. Beneath the waves lies the SS Coimbra, a British supply tanker sunk roughly 30 miles off Long Island. It is a stark symbol of Operation Drumbeat and a massive commercial hazard left right off the United States coast. Operation Drumbeat brought the war directly to the eastern seaboard, where the glow of coastal cities illuminated merchant ships for German submarines. In January 1942, a submarine torpedoed the loaded tanker. The ship sank rapidly in 180 feet of water. It went to the bottom, carrying over 2.7 million gallons of lubricating oil meant for the war effort. When a ship of that enormous size is destroyed by a torpedo and strikes the ocean floor, the physical impact is catastrophic. The Coimbra came to rest in separate, badly damaged sections, with tanks, plating, and debris partly buried and partly exposed on the seabed. But at 180 feet, it was not crushed flat by ocean pressure. Enough of the tank structure survived for divers to hot tap and remove oil almost 8 decades later. For almost 80 years, the shattered wreck sporadically leaked oil directly into the busy modern shipping lanes above, creating a persistent environmental mystery. In 2019, the United States Coast Guard performed a massive operation to clear the pumpable oil from the site. Using advanced deep water diving systems, they successfully removed 450,000 gallons from the shattered tanks. But the site remains a reminder that complete extraction is not the same as removing every trace. The Coast Guard operation removed as much as 99% of the recoverable oil, and officials described the remaining amount as very small. Any future sheening was expected to pose minimal local risk, but the wreck itself stayed on the seabed as a wartime structure turned into a modern artificial reef. The Coimbra proved that the best salvage can remove the threat without erasing the wreck. The Coimbra proved how hard it is to clear a shattered coastal wreck, but the next ship was a massive deep water giant that pushed the limits of modern salvage. A pristine Pacific lagoon was suddenly stained dark after an underwater typhoon disturbance. The source of the deep water leak was the USS Mississinewa, a massive United States Navy auxiliary fleet oiler resting at the bottom of Ulithi Atoll. This ship matters because it was an immense floating fuel station and the first United States Navy vessel sunk by a Japanese chitin-manned suicide torpedo during the war. Ulithi Atoll served as the hidden staging ground for the Pacific Fleet, housing hundreds of ships in a massive coral lagoon. In November 1944, a heavily loaded chitin torpedo struck the oiler while it was fully provisioned. The explosion ripped through the aviation fuel storage, sending a column of fire hundreds of feet into the air. The ship burned violently on the surface before sinking completely upside down in 130 feet of water. What was left behind was a 553-foot inverted maze of storage tanks deep in a remote, pristine environment. The ship rested quietly until a violent typhoon in 2001 shifted the hull, breaking the sealed compartments and releasing tens of thousands of gallons of heavy fuel into the lagoon. In 2003, the Navy responded by mounting an incredible salvage operation, ultimately pumping out 1.8 million gallons of pumpable oil, but traces still remain permanently trapped in the labyrinth. The reason nobody has fully resolved the site comes down to absolute technical and logistical limits. Pumping a massive upside-down maze requires drilling upward from the seafloor in an incredibly remote location. Because the ship is inverted, the oil floats up against the bottom of the hull, wedged into hundreds of tiny structural pockets. Perfect extraction from every shattered internal space is geometrically impossible. The uncomfortable trade-off was an engineering reality. The Navy spent millions to stop the catastrophic threat and protect the atoll, but they had to accept that retrieving the last unpumpable fractions from the deepest corner tanks was out of reach. The extraction equipment simply cannot reach the furthest internal boundaries of the inverted ship. The remains of the massive, empty steel cathedral are left behind in the dark, still holding stains, residues, and unreachable traces of fuel oil in places no pump can perfectly reach. The Mississinewa proved the extreme limits of pumping liquid oil, but the final ship shows what happens when cold, time, and damage make oil even harder to move. Mystery oil slicks appeared out of nowhere during violent winter storms, killing seabirds with no sunken ship in sight. For decades, environmental scientists and marine biologists called the unknown source the ghost spiller. The source was eventually identified as the SS Jacob Luckenbach. This was a World War II designed C-3 cargo ship lying in the Gulf of the Farallones off the coast of California. It was the ultimate invisible hazard, a massive vessel carrying a wartime fuel legacy into a post-war disaster. The Gulf of the Farallones is a treacherous stretch of water known for intense fog and severe currents. The ship sank after a violent collision in the fog in July 1953. The impact tore a massive hole in the side of the freighter. It dropped into the deep, freezing ocean, hitting the bottom in 180 feet of water. The hull was severely crushed by the impact and partly buried in the mud, heavily loaded with heavy bunker fuel. Today, estimates of what remains vary, but one commonly cited figure is roughly 29,000 gallons sealed or trapped beyond safe recovery. The strange part is that the oil does not behave like a normal open leak. It tends to appear after major storms or strong winter currents rock the damaged wreck. The reason nobody has completely drained the ship is rooted in chemistry and sheer physical destruction. Cold water makes bunker fuel thick, sticky, and stubborn. Inside a broken C-3 freighter, that heavy oil can be split into sealed pockets, damaged compartments, and spaces that divers cannot safely open. You can pump the oil that can be reached. You cannot safely recover every last sealed pocket from a protected wreck. When the winter storms arrive, heavy seas and currents can rock the wreck hard enough to release small amounts of trapped oil. That oil then rises through the water column, weathers at sea, and can return to the coast as slicks, tarballs, or oiled wildlife with the same chemical fingerprint as the Luckenbach. The uncomfortable trade-off is monumental. To chase the last inaccessible pockets, salvage crews would have to disturb a protected historic wreck inside a national marine sanctuary, with no guarantee that the environmental benefit would outweigh the damage. The site is protected under federal heritage and sanctuary rules, and the remaining oil has been sealed as far as practicable. Authorities are left with monitoring, wildlife response, and the uncomfortable knowledge that small releases may still occur after major storms. The ship rests at the bottom of the ocean like a crushed steel lung, breathing out toxic black plastic every winter. The history of the mid-20th century is slowly being broken down by the ocean. These wrecks prove that the consequences of war and heavy industry do not end when a ship hits the bottom. The steel and the oil become permanent fixtures of the underwater landscape. Modern engineering can only manage the decay, it cannot erase it completely. Leaving fuel at the bottom of the sea is almost always a forced choice driven by war graves, unexploded ordnance, corrosion, protected habitats, inaccessible compartments, viscous oil, and the hard geometry of broken ships. The surface of the water may look pristine, but below the waves, the past is still a physical presence. It only takes a single drop of thick black bunker oil breaking the surface to prove that the consequences of the war are still leaking out.